Hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. I set up this podcast to provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that conflict was connected to workplace situations or relationships outside of work. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be talking about cognitive dissonance. I'll be explaining some of the different types of cognitive dissonance and the way that they play out, the kinds of biases that they lead to in our thinking, and I'm going to give a number of different examples. Actually, all of them are workplace situations, and they might be involving a boss or a colleague who's displaying one of these different types of cognitive bias. And then I'm going to give a number of different options that you've got for responding. Now, I'm, as usual, not necessarily sitting here saying that I've got all the answers and that you should do the same thing that I do. Like, obviously, you've got a different approach and you're in a different context, so something different might work for you. But it can be very challenging knowing how to deal with these kind of people. Like, they really do find a way to stick to the belief that they already hold. And you're giving them information like, are you sure about that? And it's almost not like the blinkers go on, like, la la la, I'm not listening. It just doesn't resonate. It doesn't sink in for whatever reason. So I thought it could be helpful maybe to just explain some of the different options that you've got for dealing with the different biases and the way that they manifest. And that might prompt for you, an increased ability to generate options, for example, as a way of responding. Thank you very much, as always, for listening. If it's useful, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd be willing to press like or leave a positive review. And if you'd like more resources for dealing with conflict, please consider pressing subscribe. So the reason that I decided to talk about this topic of cognitive dissonance is that I was watching a recent episode of Joe Rogan and he had Gad Saad on and they were talking about it. And it's always really amused me as a workplace mediator, the way that people can sometimes hold on to these views, even in the face of evidence that contradicts them. The original definition, the idea of this cognitive dissonance, was developed by a psychologist called Leon Festinger. And he said that it really is about the discomfort that people experience when they hold to contradictory views. So to conflicting beliefs or evidence or even actions that they might have taken that contradict something else that they believe. This is what he called a mental discomfort. Now, for me, I think it makes sense why this would be something that's not comfortable for us. It historically probably hasn't been something that's very good for our survival. Like, we're oriented to come up with a plan and figure out the next steps that we're going to take, etc. And with an option like reconsidering something that you've done or something that you've already thought or said publicly, obviously there's a number of different consequences that come along with that. Potential shame or embarrassment that people might experience when they change their mind. It's so ironic, isn't it? Like, even in that same Gad Saad and Joe Rogan episode, they were talking about like the way that people are sometimes criticized for flip-flopping, which essentially means that they change their mind. But what do we expect people to do? Of course, we want somebody that when they learn something new and they didn't know it before, they're willing to be open to change their mind, of course. And if they're not, if they're very consistent, then either it means that they had everything 100% correct from the word go, or it might be potentially a sign that maybe they're displaying some of those different types of biases that can arise as a result of cognitive dissonance. So the dissonance is about that experience of the two conflicting beliefs coming together and the discomfort that it causes. The biases that it leads to are the types of what Leon Festinger called mental machinations, like the type of mental gymnastics that we can go through to convince ourselves that we're right, or maybe to avoid looking at information that contradicts what we already think. So the first way that this sometimes plays out is what's called confirmation bias. This is where people look at all of the data, all of the information that they've got in front of them, but they favor or prefer or only focus on the information that confirms what they already think. An example might be you've got a manager who really doesn't like staff working from home. They think that people should be in the office. It's the better option for harmony and more productive relationships, etc. And maybe when you ask them why, like, how come you're so insistent on that? I've got young kids, I travel so far, it would be so much more convenient for me not to have to come in. I work by myself, I'm not not dealing with other people in the office like someone else might in a different kind of role. And they might say something like, look, 2 years ago we tried it and it didn't work. And so that's an example of this confirmation bias. They're only looking at the information that confirms their view, the 2 weeks when they did the trial. Now, of course, there's not much logic or rational reasoning behind that potential view that they've got. They're only looking at a very small sample size, for example. Maybe technology's changed since then. And we want to encourage them to be open to think differently, but we have to tread a little bit carefully here, don't we? Because if we come across too aggressive or too adversarial, like I'm right and you're wrong, then the natural inclination is to encourage them to start to defend themselves and probably join us in this adversarial kind of dynamic. So what we would ideally want to aim for is lowering the stakes, introducing an element of curiosity, and ideally collaborative problem solving. So it might be something like, oh, okay, what happened back then? What did you end up finding? Like, that's probably where I'd start. I want to pay attention and give a bit of status and let them know that I'm, acknowledging the facts that they're looking at first. That's going to encourage a bit of reciprocity in the same way. If I'm not even willing to listen to their perspective, why on earth would they listen to mine? I'm surprised so much that people think, well, I'm right, that's why. It's like, sure, but we're talking about the reciprocal dynamics between the two of you. Like, leaving aside whether you're right or wrong, it's like, why would you expect somebody to be willing to listen to someone who's not willing to listen to them? So I'd start by saying to them, can you explain that to me? I wasn't aware of that, actually. Oh, it sounds like that did actually cause a number of challenges back then. What did you notice? And so we'd pay attention to it and flesh it out and get a bit of the facts. Now, that can be helpful in itself, I think, for dealing with people who have confirmation bias, because we're getting a more granular, nuanced understanding of even the facts that they're talking about. And maybe some people liked it back then and other people didn't. Or maybe there was a particular issue, like they might say something like, we found that remote workers really reduces productivity, or they missed deadlines, or staff were ignoring reports or something. And then we can do a little bit of problem solving, but it has to be lowering the stakes. So I really like to do it hypothetically. So look, I'm not putting you on the spot to make any decisions, and I'm not even necessarily sure this would work at all. But just thinking out loud a little bit, if we could figure out a different kind of meeting structure, for example, staff logging in at the start of every day for a quick, just catch-up meeting with their team, and you could see that maybe the issues with missed deadlines and reports had been mitigated and that was reduced, or ideally it was totally gone, would that change your mind? Like, would that be something that you would consider in your reflections as to whether work from home might work in some situations or not? So I'm constantly lowering the stakes there. Might that help you to consider? Would that be even something that you might be willing to have a chat about? Or I'm not sure if that's something that's even factored into your decision making. What do you make of this kind of thing? And we're gently wanting to find the cracks, I guess, in that brick wall that the person's presenting us with, which effectively is what they think is true, and that's that. Do you know what I mean? So some of the different possible responses that we could use there, we could say something like, that's interesting, I wasn't aware of that, could you talk me through that? And then maybe we could say something like, what else did you notice? Was there any other experiences that staff had back then? Did you find any benefit? Did you notice that staff might have been willing to work later, for example, because they didn't have to spend an hour commuting home? Or were there any advantages in terms of part-time staff or casual staff? Or like, we're trying to encourage them to take more of a nuanced view. It's not just black and white, right and wrong. It's like, what worked and what didn't? What were the positives and the negatives? What did you find were the potential advantages and what were the drawbacks? What did staff say that was good for them and that worked? How did you become aware of those issues? And what about, on the positive side of things? Was there any forum to discuss feedback or that kind of thing? Like, obviously, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, if you only have a meeting and say to the staff, I've noticed these missed deadlines, we're stopping the work from home arrangements, it's possible that there were a number of other benefits that you weren't aware of. But, again, we need to tread quite carefully in terms of the way that we bring this up with the other person that we're dealing with. I like to essentially say something like, look, let me understand your perspective, or it sounds like from where you sit, this is how you see things. really summarizing it first. So that's the first part of this next strategy that we could use. And then we could say something like, on the other hand, or actually, I used to think the same way, but when I read this or when this happened, I actually have to admit that it ended up changing my mind. What do you make of those kind of examples? Or I know other people who tend to focus on this as a priority think that we should do this instead. It's really a dilemma, isn't it? Weighing up, what should we do first? Or in the midst of these limited resources that we've got, what's the best way to use it? So we're normalizing the fact that there are these different perspectives. This is yours. We start with that first. This is ours, or this is the other one, or this is the competing evidence. And then we just get them to kind of like observe and analyze it. It's like, what do you make of this? What do you make of those two perspectives? How would you compare the evidence that both of those sides are bringing? Are there particular reasons why you favor this perspective, for example, over something like this other one? So again, we're moving out of that black and white, I'm right, and increasing the lens that they're using, I suppose, to think about the issue or the conflict that we're engaged with them in. So those are some of the different ways that we could deal with confirmation bias if we come across those kind of situations, which again is where someone's looking at the evidence available and only focusing on one particular area. The next type of bias that cognitive dissonance can lead to is what's called selective exposure. So selective exposure is where we seek out information that aligns with a view that we've already got and we avoid contradictory evidence. So whereas confirmation bias is we look at all the evidence that's there, but we favor the bits that agree with us. Selection bias is it occurs before the evidence or the information is gathered because people choose particular sources or particular ways of gathering the data that's going to confirm what they already think. In research terms, this would be what you would call a flawed study. It's not a representative sample. They've engineered things so that they can create, some type of a significant result, so to speak. But even arguing with our friends, obviously it's not a valid argument to some extent. But you might be surprised sometimes at the tenacity that people can hold on to these positions, even in the face of contradictory evidence. And it's because they're only exposing themselves to information that confirms what they already think. So, it might be that someone only watches, if you're in America, Fox or CNN, or Australia, it's Sky News or the ABC or whatever the other types of like polarized views that you've got about particular things. It might be in the music scene, you're an artist's manager and, someone else that you work with wants to really focus on heavy metal growth and they're only looking at why you should be investing in bands that are in heavy metal and you like rap and R&B or something like that. Like you'd see this type of selective exposure play out in so many different examples. So another situation in real life that I've come across when I'm doing workplace mediations is a disagreement that happens between a staff member and a boss. The staff member might disagree with what the boss is proposing, and often it's something to do with workflow or reporting structures or something like that. And rather than looking at the different perspectives, what tends to happen is that people pull out one study or one example or one anecdotal case study as a way of confirming what they already think. And it doesn't tend to get us very far in those kind of discussions. So a better option might be something like, look, I'd be happy to look at both sides if you would be willing to, like encouraging a bit of reciprocity there. Choosing the time and place to have the discussion can decrease the level of selective exposure that people are experiencing, like maybe not having a big formal meeting in front of all these people with a week ahead of time. Then they might be doing all this research and just looking for the information and facts that confirms their view. Maybe just having a less formal, more private, more confidential discussion might be a better forum to help soften up those perspectives that they've got. Or a short fuse appointment, like asking if you can chat with them about something later this afternoon rather than giving a few days to mull on it and dwell on it and that kind of thing. There are often opportunities to acknowledge common ground as well. Like we both want the best solution. You are the kind of boss that really does care about the people that work here. And it's something actually that I really value about you and your management style. And it sounds like at the moment we've got different ideas about what's best for the staff well-being or what is reasonable in terms of caseload allocation. It's like the common ground is that we really do care about staff and we want to find the right balance between accountability and flexibility or whatever the kind of conflict is that you're dealing with there. And then finally, it might be something like, look, would you be open to bringing other people into the discussion? Or looking at some of the empirical evidence, or engaging a consultant that's helped other organizations transition through these kind of changes, like bringing in a third person, especially if there's somebody that you both know and trust, that can also be a helpful option of somewhat respectfully removing that selective exposure that people might be engaging in terms of which information they're accessing, etc. So the third type of bias that you might see in terms of people's thinking at work is what's called the ostrich effect. The ostrich is in the bird, like we have the emus in Australia, but America has ostriches. And ostriches' survival strategy is that head in the sand. Do you know what I mean? So the reason that it's called the ostrich effect is because people take a head in the sand approach. This is a defensive technique that they've developed for avoiding that cognitive dissonance and the discomfort that comes along with that. So they ignore information that's perceived as negative or threatening. So in the cognitive bias part, they're favoring information that agrees with them. Selective exposure, they're seeking information that agrees with them. Ostrich effect is the next layer when you're showing them information that shows why they're wrong. I do a lot of training with construction companies, and they're working with state governments or local councils, and they're showing the government representative the problem with the design that they've been asked to do, and yet they still get a response that's kind of the head in the stand, la la la, I can't hear you, I'm not listening, that's not our fault, that's your problem, that's the risk that you took on board, all of this kind of thing. And it can be a very challenging type of behavior to deal with, I think, and very frustrating, to be honest. You might see examples of this, like investors in the business might be wanting to avoid checking their portfolio during times when there's a lot of volatility. You might find that operations managers in your company are avoiding, looking at KPIs when there's been, a really tumultuous time that they've been managing. Ostrich effect is where there is this other contradictory information that's there, but people either find a way to undermine it or not to focus on it. And a lot of the research on this, like Carlson has a study from 2009, which they actually coined this term, the ostrich effect, and they were looking at financial behaviors in particular. And they talk about part of the motivation that people engage in this is the level of distress that information causes. And so even though this additional information, more facts, it would make logical sense why we should pay attention to it, right? If we're a logical, rational kind of person, then we would want as much information as possible, as long as it's relevant, because that's going to help us make the best informed decision that we can. So the ostrich effect essentially does get in the way of that logical, rational way of working. I'll put a link, by the way, to some of the different studies that analyze this effect of cognitive dissonance, and a lot of the different strategies and examples, etc., are ones that I've come up with. But if you're interested in the phenomena and the different research that measured it, then yeah, I'll put some links in the show notes. And I will actually try to remember to put links in the show notes when I mention this moving forward as well. I would know that I've been a little bit inconsistent with that in previous episodes. I'm sorry. So how do we deal with someone who's engaging in the ostrich effect? I think to some extent there can be a benefit of just normalizing the reason why they might be doing it. Look, I know this is a really complex issue and it's difficult to know which information to trust. I know that sometimes it can feel like we've got competing evidence to weigh up, and it's not always easy on conclusion to know which way we should go. So we may be just normalizing it. It's not that you're an idiot, or it's not that you've got bad intentions, like you're malicious or selfish or something. It's to some extent understandable that you might not have weighed all of the different factors equally at the same time. And could we have a talk about this? Because I wonder if this might be relevant for this reason. So a bit of support, a bit of de-escalation, and then that gradual increase of collaborative behaviors as you go. Okay, the final type of bias that I wanted to talk about, it's sometimes called the sunken costs bias, but I just found a particular study where it was coined as the backfire effect. The authors of the studies, Nyan and Reifler, in the studies from 2010 called When Corrections Fail, the Persistence of Political Misperceptions. Another really interesting study looking at the ways that factual corrections fail. Like, people don't change their mind when they're given information. This was about the political sectors, political parties in particular. They're just not willing to listen. You know what I mean? And here's where the backfire effect comes in. So cognitive bias is when we're favoring some information that agrees with us. Then we've got selective exposure, and just scroll back up so I can remember I talked about selective exposure and the ostrich effect. The backfire effect is when it's not just that people don't want to change their mind, they double down. They double down on their original beliefs after they encounter evidence that contradicts it. Have you ever had a boss that does this? I think sometimes it's a strategy of just shutting down the conversation. Like, if you're going to make me keep talking about it, I'm going to make things worse for you. It's a bit of implied punishment or something like that. But I also think it could just be a sign of the escalation. Like, people feel like a cornered cat that's been put on the spot. And so what tends to happen then is that they're going to come out scratching, right? So you might have a manager who believes that flexible work hours might disrupt team collaboration, for example, and they might become entrenched in that belief. And you're talking to them about very well-researched cases or examples or evidence that supports flexible working arrangements. And if you come across as a little bit aggressive yourself, like, you're wrong, that is not what that paper says. You've clearly misread that. You're obviously only looking at one side of the story here. Like, when we inflame the situation in that way, and the reason that that causes that inflammation, so to speak, is because of perceived criticism. They think that you're having a go at them. They think that you're disrespecting them, so to speak, and so they want to reestablish their authority. And so even if you're giving them information that shows why they're wrong, if they interpret it as there's a little bit of disrespect or some other kind of implied threat that comes along with it, then what often comes about is that escalation as a result, and then you might see the backfire effect playing out then as the next logical step. So how do we deal with this? Well, if escalation is the thing that's contributing to it, de-escalation would be the best strategy. If it's something else, like they're worried about public embarrassment, then there might be factors that we can use to lower the stakes in that way. Like, let them know that we haven't made any decisions, or we're happy to just keep it between us, or I'd like to have a number of different meetings before we end up finalizing things, or talking to them about the process of from here you'll send a draft and they'll have a chance to provide input or give any revisions, or like, we just want to give them all of the different factors that I talk about when I'm doing de-escalation skills training. Status, we want to make them feel important, let them know that we're prioritizing what's important to them, etc. Certainty, letting them know what to expect, the limits around potential exposure and all of this kind of thing. Relatedness, a bit of empathy, like, it makes sense. You've got so many things on your plate at the moment, it's just not realistic that you would be able to spend a lot of time thinking through every single decision that you need to make every day. Like, you would never sleep, you wouldn't survive for more than a week if that was the case. So, I certainly don't want to give you the impression that I'm having a go at you. At the same time, I did want to talk maybe about work from home arrangements sometime in the next week or two. And I was hoping that we could pencil in a time to the diary to do that. What do you think? So we're lowering the stakes. We're decreasing the publicness if that was the thing that's triggering them. It might be fairness. Like, maybe we're saying to them, look, the challenge for me is that we've got particular guidelines around our award or the enterprise agreement or something like that. And the last thing we want is to be in breach of those. So I'm not telling my boss about work from home that's a priority because I'm selfish and I don't like traveling. It's because the last thing we want is to be in breach of our obligations as an employer or something else. Like, that would be an example of including fairness in the way that you talk about that particular kind of topic. So it might be those kind of elements that you find a way to include or think about how you can include. It could be lowering the stakes by maybe just talking about case studies or examples, or, I heard a story about this. What was interesting was that this they thought this and they did this, but it didn't actually play out the way that they expected. I'm not sure if you've come across that one, or what do you make of that, or what would you think in their shoes? Or, look, that makes sense. Look, you probably don't want to rush into any big decisions longer term right now. So again, we're lowering the stakes. Would you be open maybe to some discussion around the trial? Like, you wouldn't necessarily be locked into anything. And the last thing we want is for staff to have the expectation that it's going to be a permanent arrangement. But I suppose we're not really going to know how it's going to work until we give it a go. And you have talked about the previous experiments that you did a few years ago, back in 2019 or whenever it was. And, we've discussed some of the changes in technology and the different staff groups and maybe a different focus in terms of the work that people are doing as well these days. So, look, I don't know. I suppose at the end of the day, neither of us could draw conclusions about how it's going to go ultimately until we try. But that would depend on you, because the last thing I want is for you to feel like we're bombarding you with, it's an ultimatum, it's this or else. It is a factor that's important to a number of people, including myself, but we want to find a balance between the priorities of the business and yourself and other people that are involved as well. So I think I'd probably do it in that kind of a way, in my usual verbose, very wordy, roundabout, gently kind of approach. In some situations, I think I could even imagine myself being more direct. Look, I appreciate that this is your view. We've talked about this and you've explained that this is the evidence that you're looking at. You've listened to me and I've talked about some of the other factors that might be involved as well. Ultimately, I suppose we need to decide this, and if this doesn't change, this is what's going to happen. Like sometimes I just take that very direct kind of approach of, could you do this? Is this something you'd agree to? Or what's the level of flexibility that's there for you? Maybe I'd just take a compromising kind of approach. Sometimes I would just avoid it. Do you know what I mean? Even though they're not right and they're obviously displaying one of these types of cognitive bias, well, it might not be necessarily something that I need to engage in. So I suppose it really does depend on the situation that you're dealing with, doesn't it? As to what kind of a strategy is going to work for the person that you're dealing with and the context and what's at stake and all that kind of thing as well. So has that been helpful for you, me explaining the bit of background and some of, it's a very general overview that I've given around some of that early research on cognitive dissonance, the types of bias that people engage in their thinking. Have you come across any of them? I'd be incredibly curious to know. Have you encountered a boss that doesn't look at information, that doesn't confirm what they already think, or a colleague or a co-worker maybe who's been particularly stubborn and you've had a hard time changing their mind? I'd love to know your experiences as well. The best way to get in touch at the moment is the email address podcast@simongood.com. If you'd like to check me, learn a little bit more about me and the work that I do, mediations, training workshops, that kind of thing, my website is simongood.com. That's SIMONGOODE.com. Thank you very much for listening. As I said, if you'd like more resources for dealing with conflict, please consider pressing subscribe. And if you'd like video content as well, please head over and check out the YouTube channel. It's @SimonGood over there. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again in a future episode of the Conflict Skills Podcast. Bye for now.